As you listen, keep in mind that though this podcast features medical and other professionals and regularly speaks on the topic of psychoactive substances in a positive light, nothing heard here should ever be taken as medical advice or as encouragement to consume any of the substances mentioned, especially the ones that are blatantly illegal in your country of residence. Listen critically and always check in with yourself before acting based on anything you hear or read on the internet.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of ATTMind Radio. I am your host, James W. Gesso, and if you're watching this on YouTube, which you might be, I have to apologize for my extremely casual attire today, but in fact it is pajama day here at the home office, like it is every day. But today I just decided that why dress up? I'm feeling good, I'm feeling comfortable, I got my Wu-Tang hoodie on. I'm feeling fresh. So thank you for participating in Pajama Friday here at the home office. Other than that, if you've heard me say this before, then you know what I'm about to say, and that is that this podcast is brought to you by Patreon, which means that you guys are supporting it through crowdfunding. If you've heard me say this before, you're probably excited because you've already supported Patreon. If you haven't heard me say this before, welcome to the podcast. Please go check it out. And if you've heard me say this before and you're not excited, that probably means because you haven't checked it out yet and you're maybe just a little bit annoyed, but I think that means you should probably go check out jameswgesso.com/support and see why it is that I keep mentioning this thing over and over and over again, because it's what brings the podcast to you guys. Other than that, I have one other announcement, which is exciting, that I am, unless everything spontaneously changes, I will be going to Australia in March to be at Maitreya Festival. So if there's any Australian listeners, please check out Maitreya Festival's website and head over and come hang out with me down under. That would be very, very exciting. Now that that's all out of the way, I'd like to welcome Mel Mariposa. Is that how you say your name?
Yeah.
Okay, close enough. I'd like to welcome her to the show. Mel is a queer polyamorous relationship anarchist and the author of the blog Polysingleish. She is an advocate for consent culture and building authentic, dynamic relationships. As a co-producer of the successful Erotica Electronica Nights in Vancouver, she is known to many in the EDM scene of Vancouver for her forward and engaging style. A trained bodyworker, Mel also holds a certification in counseling for intimacy and relationships from the Vancouver College of Counselor Training. And through her practice, radical relationship coaching, she helps individuals discover new dimensions of their relationships to themselves and to the people in their lives. Thank you for being on the show, Mel.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Mm-hmm. I believe we met at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference this year, did we not?
That's correct.
Yeah, unlike some of the other presenters who I've had on the show, you weren't a presenter there. We met as both attendees, and you were sitting right in front of me. Yeah, which is, nice to make those types of connections, and then to later find out when I checked out your blog what it is that you're doing, because it is very exciting stuff. I had read one of your articles, the one on radical self-responsibility. Is that?
Radical responsibility.
Yeah, so I want to touch on that with you a little bit, but what I'm really interested in is what seems to be a very developed and mature approach to polyamory that I very much resonate with. And being someone who's been basically practicing and exploring and refining the art and the style of polyamory in my own life over the last 7 or 8 years, I find it really nice to connect with people who also have a very mature and developed approach to it. So my first question for you here on the podcast is, if you could, assuming that the listeners, who they probably aren't in this situation, but assuming that the listeners have never heard of polyamory or might have just some very surface level understanding of what it is, can you give a definition to that word and what it seems to be representing sort of generally in human culture right now?
Yeah. So polyamory is the term given to describe a form of honest non-monogamy. So, there's dishonest non-monogamy, which we know that's called cheating. Right. And there's many forms of honest non-monogamy where everybody involved is aware that there's other partners, it's consensual. And polyamory specifically is a type of non-monogamy where emotional bonds can be formed, where people can share their lives with one another in a more continuous and extended way, or at least there's the potential for that. So it differs from things like swinging. Swinging, there's open relationships in terms of sexuality, but you're not necessarily going to move in together or create a family together. It's more of a sex-based connection. But with polyamory, there's room for emotional connection. There's room for sharing life together. And there are multiple partners, and everyone is fully aware and enthusiastically consenting to that.
Mm-hmm. I guess in sort of the most easily accessible information on, say, polyamory how-to, there are different, say, types of polyamory, and I'm wondering if you could go into some of those different types, and then, but omitting your personal thing, because I want to ask you about that afterwards.
Yeah, totally. So what we see is that the media has perpetuated a few different models. So when people hear the word polyamory, the first thing that they normally think of in the general population is polyandry, is basically people having multiple husbands or multiple wives, and that can bring up an idea of like a very, especially the one man, many wives, brings up this idea of a very patriarchal kind of cultural norm. That's a separate thing from polyamory. The other thing that gets out there is what called poly. So that is this idea of a couple who have a monogamous relationship deciding to open up and adding a third to their relationship as an equal partner, or alternatively going out and dating other people on the side.
Before you continue, that last one that you mentioned, the definition was cut off due to a glitch. What was the name of that style?
Polynormativity.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So polynormativity is what shows, like there's the Married and Dating reality TV series that has a lot of polynormativity in it, and I think that's become the predominant model that a lot of people get exposed to. This idea that you have a primary partner that you have a committed relationship with, and it's a solid committed relationship, and then you open up from there and you add people on. Now, some people will do it adding on in a more casual style, so they'll have short-term recreational relationships. Some people add on in what I've heard termed as more multiple monogamy, so multiple long-term committed relationships, possibly coming together, creating a polyfidelitous triad. So polyfidelity being you're committed as a closed group, polyfidelitous triad or group, which opens up into realms of like group marriage and those kinds of arrangements. Yeah.
Great. So I feel like this polynormative style, I think that's a great way to describe it. I previously understood it as being having a primary relationship and then multiple secondary partnerships. And the challenges of polyamory, I'm sure we'll get into afterwards. But my next question is that, having discussed these different, say, culturally accessible surface models, you have a very specific form that you talk about, which I guess you must have created because of a dissatisfaction with the general cultural memes going on around polyamory at the time. And you call it Polysingleish, or maybe just Singlish, and then also relationship anarchy. Is that the other term?
Well, so I'll rewind a little bit, tell you a bit of my story.
Yeah.
So I was in a mostly monogamous marriage for about 7 years. And when that marriage ended, a big reason for that was that I needed to explore polyamory. I knew that was a strong desire for me. And so newly single, what I had in my mind was that I want to go find a primary partner, and then exactly as you're saying, add on secondary relationships from there. And I very quickly discovered that didn't feel right for me. There was something jarring about having just come out of this almost fairy tale like relationship with someone who was like, oh, this person must be the one, and dedicating my life to that. I didn't want to rededicate myself to anybody in that way. I felt that I needed to focus on the relationship with myself first and foremost. And so in that, I started looking for role models. And I was actively getting involved in the Vancouver polyamory groups. There's a regular discussion night that happens in Vancouver, the Vancouver Poly 101. And starting to go there, I didn't hear anybody really sharing from a place that I resonated with. But I knew that there was something happening for me that I wanted to articulate, and because I couldn't find any other articulation for it, I decided to write about it myself. Now, at the same time, there's another blogger called Aggie Says who started writing about very much the same thing, and her blog is called Solo Poly. So we started writing our blogs around the same time. She's got 10 more years experience as a writer than I have. She's got 10 more years experience in polyamory. So I eventually found her blog and we connected. So I describe myself as a solo polyamorist now, but certainly when I started, for lack of a better term, I'm single-ish, like monogamish, like Dan Savage talks about monogamish and this idea of, mostly monogamous, but occasionally something else happens. I'm mostly single and occasionally other things will happen. And that's definitely evolved since then. But still that focus remains that my primary relationship is with myself. And that was my commitment that I made. I'm like, okay, for the next 2 years, this is how it goes. My relationship with myself comes first, and I'm not going to allow myself to succumb to any kind of like Disney fantasies about this Prince Charming who's going to ride into my life. And, lots of would-be Prince Charmings come along and it's like, this is good. This is totally fine where this is at. I don't need to get into any kind of fantasies about living together or moving in or getting married. So that was the origin of where the blog came out of. So then you asked about relationship anarchy. So it was a friend of mine in Germany, Alan, who introduced me to the term relationship anarchy for the first time. And he's another blogger. We're both writing about similar things. And so relationship anarchy is this whole other idea. So polyamory in North America grew out of the free love movement. There's a lot of social, cultural events that help create polyamory to be what it is in North America. Meanwhile, in Europe, something very different took off. Andy Norgin, who's a blogger in the anarchist realm, wrote the Relationship Anarchist Manifesto. And in that outlines some principles for relationships that really recognize every individual's sovereignty and autonomy. And that has been explored quite a bit in Europe over the last couple of decades. It's only in the more recent years that it's made its way over to North America. And I call it the third wave of polyamory, that a lot of people have been doing that primary, secondary model of relating to each other in polyamorous circumstances, but that hasn't always felt good. And there's a sense of feeling obligated to maintaining those hierarchical labels in that that polynormative model. In relationship anarchy, it's not that there is no hierarchy, there can be, but it's very much based on the individuals in the relationship. So it's very much celebrating everyone's autonomy and sovereignty. And, two people come together and it's like, well, what is it that you need, want, and desire? What is it that you need, want, and desire? And explore the overlap between it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. Why? Where do the questions go from here? So I'm curious why somebody would want to have multiple partners. Why is it that, humans such as, myself or yourself might not be resonant with the idea of monogamy or the idea of this long-term pair bonding, right? So why would people reach towards monogamy, and what might be some key signs for a person that they aren't resonating with their previous relationship models and might be interested or might benefit from exploring polyamory?
There's a lot of potential reasons, and I've noticed that it can differ very greatly. I offer a workshop called Honest Non-Monogamy for beginners, and in that we explore some of the possible reasons that someone might choose polyamory or even just open relationships in general. One of the key factors is this feeling that one person cannot possibly satisfy all your needs, wants, and desires, that it's actually too much pressure to ask one person to meet all those needs. And, you think of the way that you spend time with your friends. You're not going to have one best friend and you're like, you're the person who I'm going to go fishing with, and I'm going to go dancing with, and I'm going to smoke weed with, and I'm going to go skiing with, and like all these different activities. It would be very rare to find that one person who you can do all those things with. So in the same way, in romantic and sexual, intimate relating, it's a lot of pressure to expect one person to meet all of your needs. And so where a lot of people start diving into non-monogamy is perhaps having attraction to more than one gender, for example, and really feeling that they need to have that as part of their own personal sense of fulfillment, that they need to have sexual interactions with more than one gender. It could also be very varied sexual tastes. So a lot of people find their way into non-monogamy through getting an interest into kink and other alternative sex practices. And, one partner may not be into all of those things. So you have another partner who you can explore some other aspects of it with. There's also, I think, a tribal element that can come in for some people. I look at the way that society we live in today has grown very disconnected. We don't live in strong family units the way that our ancestors did. And I think that there may possibly be a part of ourselves that's craving that again. And polyamory is a means to recreate a tribe around you. You might have one or two partners, but they may also have one or two other partners, and those people have partners, and it ends up forming this kind of molecular structure. We call it a polycule as opposed to a molecule. It's a polycule, and the same people show up again and again inevitably, and that can create a sort of feeling of family and tribe. So I think that's another reason. I see a lot of people drawn to polyamory out of a desire to challenge societal norms. So the dominant Western society model is very individualistic. It's very patriarchal in terms of it's hierarchical, that there's a control dynamic that's implicit in relationships. And people want to challenge that. People want to challenge notions around jealousy and ownership in relationships. This idea that, we're together and so you're obligated to do this thing for me. We're kind of throwing that out of the window and going, well, no, nobody's obligated to do anything. You get free range to decide what commitments you want to make. And within that, that makes you question, well, what's authentically real for me? It's not about finding my perfect soulmate or partner necessarily. It's about what is it that I need to feel fulfilled? And then you realize that needs multiple people to actually come together as a full picture.
So I think there are different ways to approach polyamory. And one of them is a healthy way, and then the other one is an unhealthy way, right? So, I mean, there's obviously multiple ways, but if we were to make a very generalized dichotomy, these are the two ways that you can do it, and they often overlap. For myself, over the last, like I said, 7 or 8 years, maybe longer, that I've been exploring polyamory, it has gone through phases. And the first phase wasn't polyamory so much as it was multiple girlfriends without any of the other girlfriends knowing about the other girlfriend, but me totally uncommitted, so it didn't matter. This is, early 20s. Like late teens, early 20s, right? And then as it evolved, I kind of got into understanding that there was this whole other thing there, this polyamory concept, and began to really work on going through a lot of the, I guess, emotional issues that I had inside of me, left over from, nobody's family was functional. So the levels of dysfunction that were present in my family dynamics growing up, and then also just the general dysfunction that I was offered emotionally and socially in regards to my cultural upbringing, and the internalized stereotypes that I had in regards to what it means to be in love, what it means to be in a relationship, what it means to be a man in a man-woman relationship, what it means to be heteronormative, what it means to be sexual, all of these things. And that polyamory, like all relationships, became a place wherein I was forced to really look at those things in order to feel any level of comfort. Where default monogamy, you don't really have to look at those things. Everyone can just work on assumptions until the micro cracks that you're not looking at create huge fissures in the relationship, and then everything falls apart or goes really negative. And it worked as a really, really powerful tool of transformation for me, right? And a lot of it coming from this place of working on cultivating and developing the self in a healthy way. Now, in this time, I've also come to recognize a lot of where my challenges are existing now, as well as where what I thought was healthy behavior in the past turned out to be unhealthy behavior, and the unhealthy behavior being behavior that comes out of an acting from past wounds, rather than a healthy behavior coming from a place of acting towards some sort of resolution with the acknowledgement of past wounds. Normally, the former needs to exist for the latter to be applied, right? And one of the things that I saw is that the initial time in my polyamory came from basically as symptoms of love avoidance in me, to protect myself from monogamy, basically, all the negative things that I internalized about it, and also as a way to protect myself from basically committing to a monogamous relationship. And then once I was within a highly love-oriented monogamous relationship, or monogamish polynormative relationship, which is the models that I followed previously, that I noticed that I'd go from love avoidant to a love addict in the relationship. And there's a lot maybe to unpack here. But what I'm basically wanting to ask you, having kind of given my own little personal history there, is about this question of authenticity and this question of defining and doing things for the self, because I think it's very, very easy for someone to, because of past wounds, move towards a place of resolving wounds into healing, but doing so in a way that only is acting from other deeper wounds that they didn't see. And that authenticity and doing things to take care of the self can often be an act of selfishness and evading responsibility, and as ulterior ways of avoiding the very traumas that were causing conflict in the previous relationship style. So I'm curious if you can just please go into and elucidate the psychological, emotional problems that we can bring into polyamorous relationships and could even lead us to polyamory, and how we can identify them and how we can work through them in a positive way.
I love that you're asking this. This touches on what I call the shadow side of polyamory, which is something that does not get talked about. It's a very sensitive issue, and I want to recognize that for people listening or watching this, that if you're exploring polyamory, some of these may resonate for you, and if they resonate for you, it doesn't mean that this is not your path. I think it's something to just be aware of. I think that yes, our wounds they can be huge motivating factors. Like Gabor Mate talks about how the feeling of disconnection that can grow in us as children can lead to addictive behavior. And I think that there is absolutely an element of addictive behavior that can crop up in relationships, especially when it comes to sex. If we look at sex itself, during sex, there's all these hormones that are released in the body, all these different feel-good chemicals, and those can become addictive. In a new relationship, there is what gets termed NRE, new relationship energy, and that's intoxicating. That's addictive. And there's a lot of, some people who are new to polyamory, it's like you're a kid in a candy store and it's like, I can date all the people. And you get this rush of all those hormones, and then you get addicted and you keep looking after the next hit, the next hit, the next hit. So going back to those core wounds, yes, I think that there is a side where people are drawn to exploring polyamory. Sometimes their core relationship is not working and they're not looking at that. That's what happened for me. There was some aspects of it that show me that polyamory was always part of my life in some ways, or at least non-monogamy was. But in the marriage that I was in, there were big incompatibilities, but we were both blinding ourselves to. And so trying to explore an open relationship was a way to avoid looking at that. Ironically, it actually brought it right into our faces. So it's interesting to acknowledge that even when we try to avoid these things, it will keep showing up. Talking about these wounds, I think that it's hard. It's hard in the society that we live in. There are so many solid messages given to us about what a relationship is supposed to look like, and how having a relationship look that way makes us a successful grown-up. And we all want to be a successful grown-up, right?
Right. We've been bred to want to be acknowledged by the adults as an adult.
Yeah. And there's a lot of fears that can come up, and we can avoid our fears by running off into other relationships. And if you look at the reasons why somebody can have an affair, a lot of those can crop up in what I call this shadow side of polyamory. A fear of commitment. Absolutely, there's a fear of commitment. I can acknowledge that a lot of my polyamory in the early days was a fear of commitment. It was coming from a very strong desire to not have to commit, to not be pressured into anything. Now you're talking about that fine line between prioritizing self-relationship and acting from a place of selfishness without regard to other people. This is an interesting area to explore. The solo polyamory movement, which has really blossomed a lot in the last 2-3 years, we have a Facebook group where, all these very wonderful independent people can group together. And it's wonderful having that peer support and seeing what themes come up again and again and again. And I have observed that there is an element of, along with the isolation that people can feel, I think that there is a piece where we forget that we are in relationship to everybody around us too. And this ties into that article that you said you read of mine with the radical responsibility. No person is an island. We exist in community together. We exist on a planet together. Even before you and I met at that conference, there was a relationship between us. We just didn't know what it was. And so in the art of connecting and talking, we get to understand what that relationship is. And we find the things that we have in common that we're interested in, that we want to talk about. There's an element in polyamory where people forget that. And it's like, I can just do what I want. And I think that a part of that is coming from this strong desire to assert the individual self that has been pushed down by a lot of societal expectations that haven't felt authentic. It's kind of like this that repression can be so extreme that we have to go to this other extreme in order to balance it out. And people can get hurt in that, absolutely. It's very tricky. I can certainly look at my own experience and go, yep, there is some things that I did that were really not cool, acting out of a place of selfishness. And I think that the more we talk about it and don't ignore that that's a factor, the more we offer space for people to come and find an emotionally mature place of their individuality, one that doesn't ignore the connection to community.
Mm-hmm. I think it's the way that you're describing this, almost like an evasion of responsibility that's a part of, breaking your shell out of cultural conditioning sounds very similar to being a teenager. It's very adolescent type behavior, and in a way, when you first start out, let's just say, I'm working off this stereotypical journey of default monogamy not working, polyamory okay, and then realizing like, oh, I've been fucking this whole polyamory thing up the whole time, maturity. It would be like you're this infant and you're just inside of exactly what you've been given within the relationship ecology. We'll throw it back to the parental ecology. You only have what was already given to you, right? Yep. And then you move into the adolescent, like, no, I'm going to be the exact opposite, which is equally as immature, but it's like from a different place. And then you eventually go to this place of recognizing like, oh, okay, I can be both, and I choose to be the one that's most authentic to me. And in this particular journey of acknowledging responsibility to others, there's this importance to recognize that it's very easy to turn polyamory into an evasion of responsibility for other people's feelings, and often from a place of trauma or wounding that's left over almost definitely from the way you watched your parents interact with each other or not interact with each other, and the way that they mutually as well as individually interacted with you to lay the base trauma foundations for how you'll interact with the rest of the world. And there's all sorts of different ways that this behavior can unfold. I like that you quoted Gabor Mate there. I think he is a brilliant man, and his work with addiction is very interesting. And in the same presentation that we watched at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, he talks about how his first thing that he'll ask somebody who's facing addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And that the addiction is a way to avoid the pain. Well, I think when it comes to being in a relationship, the shadow side of polyamory in a way could be evading the pain by having a sex addiction, or having a multiple relationship addiction, or an addiction to the NRE. But it can also work as in an avoidant way too. So we constantly block ourselves. So we need multiple partners to block ourselves from intimacy. Either way, what we're doing is we're trying to protect ourselves from some sort of past pain. We might become addicted to love because we have the pain of abandonment. We become addicted to sex because we have the pain of fearing what it means to be fully intimate with a person and have that then eventually destroy us in some way. I'm currently reading a book right now called The Truth by Neil Strauss, have you read it? I'm seeing you nod.
I have not, but I have a few friends who are reading it, and I'm following along with the revelations in there.
Yeah, it's some big ones. I'll throw a link to that in the show notes here. And I think really choosing to utilize, and this is not necessarily of the book, but I think it's something that's important that you brought up in regards to you recognizing that at first your move from monogamy, default monogamy to polyamory was to avoid some of this pain stuff, but then it only just threw it in your face anyways, is that the pain is going to happen no matter what. And the pain that comes up in a loving, trusting relationship, whether it be polyamorous or monogamous, is usually, if it's not reflective of direct abuse, which if you ever feel like you're being directly abused, you should definitely talk to somebody about that and not just welcome it. But the pain that comes up in a loving, trusting relationship is usually from a place of that pain being old, like long since already there, and just called to the surface because emotionally you've softened enough so in trust with your partner that there's this established trust that you can start to throw your shit onto them, right? But and if you catch it in time, or they catch it in time, you can work through that. And I think learning to look back, and instead of being like, oh no, this doesn't feel good, I'm out, or whatever it is to avoid it, that you really look at why this is there. And in order to build a supportive, trusting relationship with somebody you can feel that the precious thing that you're sharing with them in vulnerability is secure, comes from having mutual responsibility to each other and building trust through an exchange of trustworthiness. And you can never have that if you never choose to accept the mature responsibility for somebody else's tenderness and precious vulnerability as well. And that's something that can play out very strongly in polyamorous relationships. And it also play out very strongly in monogamous relationships, monogamish relationships, basically any relationship wherein both parties are conscious of that exchange, the relationship itself being a container for personal growth and personal development and mutual love and mutual growth.
That's really, really beautifully said. Yeah, I think that there is, at our core, we all have a core need, a core desire to be seen and to be accepted and to be embraced for who we are at our most authentic. And ironically, we search for that, and at the same time we're afraid to let somebody see all the sides of ourselves. Very often we put on this like warm, glossy front, especially at the beginning in a relationship, and sometimes that always stays there, and we never get into the nitty gritty. I'm involved with a group here in Vancouver that are practicing the Zeg forum, as practiced in Tamara in Portugal, and this is a method of community communication whereby someone stands up and shares their story. They share authentically where they are at, and other people in the group then mirror what it is that they heard. And it's a really profound way to feel heard and seen and honored by community. And in one of my relationships, we're exploring transferring that practice into the relationship between us, because we both are going to this thing on a regular basis. It's just naturally arising in our communication. And it's really profound to be able to see somebody and not to dive in and try to fix their wounds, and not to look to the other person to try and fix your wounds, but simply to be like, this is where I'm at. Okay, this is where you're at. And that recognition is powerful and can help build that deeper connection. And I think it's from the deeper connection that we find the healing in of itself. But when we're not allowing ourselves to share authentically, polyamory can absolutely be a way to avoid that. We get the illusion of being seen because we're being seen by multiple people, and we're allowing them to go this deep, but across a wider surface area perhaps. But if you're never allowing anybody in deep, are you actually allowing yourself to go in deep into whatever those core wounds may be?
And I really acknowledge how much can be learned from having multiple relationships where you're only going, this deep. For the people who are listening and not watching this in video, a shallow amount. There's a lot that can be learned, but to use a term from my own models, like the true advancement of psychospiritual maturity that can be gained in a relationship is really at those deeper levels. It's when you go into those vulnerable places. And those vulnerable places, like I said previously, they require having trust in the relationship, which requires an exchange back and forth of trust and trustworthiness. Now, I like that you said that we're not islands, but at the same time, I like to think about islands as a great metaphor to understand it, that we are islands. And if we completely shut ourselves off, then we're just going to consume our own resources, and we're not going to be very dynamic, and we'll probably just, die away because we're not self-sustainable islands, right? So we need to build bridges and connections with others for resource sharing, right? And that the larger the bridge, these bridges we'll say they pass back and forth in relationship a variety of resources, but they're also bridges of vulnerability, right? And they're built on an exchange back and forth of trust and trustworthiness. And the more you offer trust, receive trustworthiness, take trust, respond with trustworthiness, the larger these bridges can get, and the more vulnerability you can transit back and forth, and the more nourished you can be in revitalizing an island that was likely, stricken with a lot of damage from 0 years of age to however you are old now, figuring out that something's wrong. And I guess I'm just like really driving home that premise of cultivating trust in a relationship. Now, my next question for you is specifically, what do you see as some of the things that can first come up, the first challenges that can come up when facing polyamory that are reflective of this deeper healing we've been talking about, and even just generally, what kind of challenges might come up in a polyamorous relationship, and how you would suggest to work with it personally and then also interpersonally with your partner in a healthy and constructive way.
So the two most common things that I see as stuff that comes up, one is understanding what you desire, understanding what your needs and wants are. And the second is dealing with fear. And under fear, I'd include jealousy. But I'll go into a little bit about why I say fear first and foremost. So the piece about knowing what we want, we talked about how society just gives us this set of assumptions about relationships. And so the moment you step out of that place of assumption, and this is true in whether you're doing polyamory or not, there are absolutely ways to do monogamy consciously without the default assumptions. So this applies to that as well. The second you step out of the assumptions, you have no script to follow. There are no role models, and that's very scary. It's like, here is this huge terrain and you have no map. For those of you who've been to Burning Man, it's like the last day of Burning Man when they take all the street signs off and you're like, wait, I have no idea where I am because all the camps are, disassembled and there's a dust storm and where do I go from here? And in that space, we have to figure out, well, what feels right for me. And if we don't stop to figure that out, we're kind of just wandering aimlessly, and just that can be great. You can discover a lot of things. You may come across something as you're wondering and maybe like, wow, I had never considered this. This sounds great. I'm going to make this part of my life now. But in that space of not knowing, there can be amazing possibilities, but you can also get lost. In that space, it's very easy for somebody else with a very strong desire to come in and say, this is what I want. And you don't know what you want, and you're like, oh, that sounds okay, sure, I'll do that. And you accommodate to what somebody else wants, because that's what we're used to doing in relationships, accommodating. And you can get stuck. And very often we don't realize it at first because we have a certain level of tolerance for dealing with things that are not in full authenticity to us. But if over time that starts to come up more and more, and I've certainly seen relationships where one person wants to be polyamorous, the other person doesn't, but they really want to be with that person. So they're like,
I know
okay.
what that feels like.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's a very challenging situation to be in. So that's the first piece, is getting clear about what you want. And I mean, that's the most important thing in any relationship. And that's something that we don't get taught how to articulate that in high school. For some reason, that's not part of sex ed.
The only things I learned in high school, I learned in regards to relationships, I learned from other kids my age and porn. So I didn't really learn much about healthy polyamory or knowing what I want and knowing how to define what I want. Other than I knew when I was 17, I really wanted blowjobs and sex.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is a very broad category.
Right.
Can you imagine if in high schools they actually taught us classes about how to figure out what it is that we want and how to like backtrack through our desires to what the core needs are and then how to articulate and ask for that?
Mm-hmm. I actually had a previous partner who one of her like lifetime goals that she would talk about is refining herself in a way that would enable her to build a model to teach something like Lovemaking 101 to high school students or something. And I think that would be great because there's not enough proper emotional development education happening in that realm.
Emotional development. I want to come back to that.
Yeah, please.
So the second piece, fear. Fear comes up. I think that we tend to default in society in general to a model of scarcity. We believe that things are scarce. And, I could totally dive off into a tangent about how that relates to capitalism and et cetera, et cetera. But we go from this model of scarcity and that love is scarce. That if this person is not with me, then they're just me and they're going to abandon me. And so having sought out connection, recognizing that our core desire is to feel connection, to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel loved, this concept that they might love somebody else and that means that there's less love available for me, that brings up a huge amount of fear. Are you able to hear me okay still?
Yes, the video is connecting, syncing back up with the audio. Please keep going.
Okay. Cool. So this sense of loss comes up, and you'll hear that in polyamory, jealousy is the most common thing that will come up for people. But I've learned that jealousy is really rooted in this fear of loss, and this fear of loss also touches on all those wounds inside of us, the fear of abandonment, the fear of I'm not good enough, I'm not attractive enough, I'm not skilled enough to be able to meet this person's needs emotionally, physically.
The fear that you will just hate your life eventually.
Yeah. Eventually he'll get bored of me and go off with like some 22-year-old who's like younger and hotter and sexier than me, or I'll
be stuck in a sexless marriage or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Nobody's happy and there's just bickering. When you think about that stereotypical dysfunctional marriage it's like the joke, right? It's like, how much sex do you have after you're married? None, the first year, and that's it. And of course, anyone who's actually thinking about that logically is like, I don't want that shit, thanks, but I'd kind of like to keep having it if possible. But yeah, fear. I'm sorry to have jumped off topic there.
Well, and these are fears that exist in the monogamous paradigm too. Mm-hmm. But if you're in the mononormative model, you just don't think about it. Out of sight, out of mind. I don't have to deal with my fear.
Okay, pause. I'm gonna kill this video for a second. If you want to kill yours, if you can hear me at all. Hey, can you hear me?
I lost your video. Yep, I can hear you again.
I just killed it for a second to help the bandwidth come back. Okay, so sorry everyone, we just lost reception there. Hopefully we don't lose it again. But you were just talking about how these fears are present in a monogamous relationship as well. Oh, I've lost your video. Hey.
Hi.
So, okay, actually, now that the thing is cut and we're kind of paused for a second, I really need to pee. I'll be right back.
Okay, sure.
All right.
So I lost your video feed. Maybe you turned your video off. There we go.
I just killed my video when the reception goes bad because,
Yeah.
yeah, it just makes sense to do that.
Okay.
Okay.
So,
well, sorry everyone that we lost reception there for a bit, but getting back on track, Mel, you were just talking about how these fears that you were mentioning can come up in monogamous relationships as well, but that in the what'd you call it, the mononormative model?
yeah, mononormative.
That we don't even think about it.
Yeah, and I think when we're faced with the reality of that, this happens for monogamous couples where there's infidelity. Suddenly you're faced with the reality of, oh my gosh, this person has in some way given some connection to somebody else, and does this mean there is less for me? That can come up in a big way. So when we're looking at non-monogamy and we're going back to talk about the kinds of core wounds that we are all dealing with, that's where that starts to come up. And we have to dive in and deal with our shadow self and our shadow emotions and the things that we would much rather, put in a little box and put it away on the shelf or just forget that it's there. But actually, the moment you start relating with more people, it's going to start bringing it out. And some people are very good at pushing it away again and again and again. Some people can develop a way of taking it out in careful pieces and examining it one element at a time. And that's where I think that the opportunity for relationships to be spaces of transformation and growth is huge, because when you do allow yourself to be in that space of vulnerability with somebody and you allow that trust to enter in, whereby you can go to those places in yourself and explore what are the wounds, what are the needs that are coming out of this wound, and how is that manifesting in my world, whether it's directly to heal or directly to avoid the wounds. What does that look like? Those are really powerful places to explore, and doing them in relationship with somebody can be way more effective than doing it by yourself.
I'm going to go to a really sciencey place right now, but there is this man, his name is Stephen Porges. He talks about something called the polyvagal theory, referencing the vagus nerve being the primary nerve that communicates sensory information from within your body, in particular the functioning of your organ systems, to the brain to then interpret whether or not it should respond in a threat or safety mechanism associated to the sympathetic nervous system, and then also through that regulating, called neuroregulation, of the organ systems themselves. And part of this vagal system is, there's three tiers to it. One is the sort of the old reptilian tier that will respond to threat with feigning death, which is extremely damaging to mammals because we have a lot of brain needs. So we have this next layer that is fight or flight, right? And then we have this third layer, which he calls the myelinated vagus. It's only 3% of the vagus nerve, and it is what turns off the threat response on the other levels. And this is, when activated, it tells the nervous system to let go of fight or flight and to go into growth and restoration. It's the part that whenever you feel that sense of being lovingly accepted or lovingly grateful, HeartMath calls it coherence. I'm using little air quotes for people listening. That what that does is it tells the nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, that it can stop responding to threat. And one of the ways that this is activated is through basically being held, literally or even figuratively, by another mammal whom there is love and trust. There's other things too about sound and how a person speaks to you. If there's threat in the voice, there's a threat in the body. But a softer, everything's okay, kind of yoga teacher voice, that actually does help people calm down if they're not just angry that somebody's talking like that. And so in a relationship, what's coming up when we're being triggered are these old wounds that exist since we're very, very young. And the thing is that in the relationship, the deeper the intimacy goes, the bigger the triggers will be, the more of a cumulative emotional charge you will feel in the moment in regards to these past wounds. And that having someone who you trust that can hold you literally and figuratively to be in that place enables the capacity for us to heal through those things and remap how the nervous system responds to this trauma through the activation of the myelinated vagus. So that establishment of trust can be very, very important. And I think for myself, one of the things that I've noticed over the course of my polyamorous history is that each time I have felt as though I've fallen in love. This is like the classical falling in love. Not the, I have a deep trust for this person, it's good, I love them, and I mean that. The classical falling in love, oh my God, that person, and it's been sustained. There's so many more fears and vulnerabilities that come up for me. And what I've learned is that, okay, my past is really obvious to me now, which is that it's all good and it's all fine, polyamory, let's have it until I fall in love, and then I'm okay with being polyamorous, but I'm really threatened about that other person being with other people, right? It got reinforced when I came to a point in my life where I was like, I want to explore monogamy with a person, and they weren't ready, and it was very challenging for me. And so what I've learned now that seems to be working very well for me in my most recent experiences of falling in love is to acknowledge that if there's a lot of vulnerability that's coming up for you, and it's in regards to a specific person, to tell that person. If you're falling in love with a person, and that's a deep thing, and you're being very responsible with those words, understanding the depth that it can represent to another person when you say it within a romantic relationship, perhaps it's important to consider that who you've defined yourself as socially in the past doesn't necessarily need to be the person you define yourself in the future, and that it could be a really good idea to discuss with your partner about having a sexual or romantic exclusivity until the amount of trust is built for the level of vulnerability that's there to reopen things up later, if that's what you want, right? If that's what you both mutually want, and knowing again what it is that you want, what you're prepared to offer, and being, I don't know, soft and open to cultivating trust and open to facing the wounds that will come up with this new partner.
I think that's great. And what I hear you expressing in that is mindfulness. And this, again, ties back to that level of responsibility that we have to other people. I think mindfulness is one of the greatest practices we can cultivate in relationships, whatever your relationship style is. And, there's been a thread of conversation in the world of polyamory about, you don't take on responsibility for how other people feel. If they're going to be irrational and do their thing, that's their thing. They're responsible for their reaction, have to feel responsible for how they reacted. But I think that that's kind of callous. And I think that if someone has a reaction to me, that may not have been my intent, but I have a responsibility to examine the actions that created that reaction.
Agreed.
And be mindful of that in the future, no matter whether that reaction was a positive one or a not so positive one.
Hey, I'm getting really terrible reception.
Okay, can you hear me again?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm gonna keep my video off for a minute to see if that helps.
Okay, sure.
And then if it starts to be flowing really nicely, I'll turn it back on. So the last thing that you were saying before you got cut off was
mindfulness.
Mindfulness.
Yeah. So yeah, I think mindfulness is one of the best practices to have in relationships, and that feeds into recognizing a level of responsibility. That if someone is reacting in a particular way, that you have somehow been a part of that. If your actions have created that reaction, and that's whether someone is like madly in love with you or they hate you. And this is true not just in romantic relationships, but in the way that we all interface into our communities and into all kinds of relationships.
So I think it's an important point to make here that if that is an avenue you want to go in cultivating mindfulness in yourself, to make that very clear to your partner, and also to assess with your partner what level of mindfulness they're looking to hold. And if you're not on the same page, then you probably shouldn't be in that relationship. And that it takes two to tangle. Pardon that. But
at least two to tango.
It takes at least, yeah. It's not a dance party until there's more than one person, I suppose. So I think it's important to make sure that you're communicating and keeping on that level with somebody, which is leading me into my next question, which is going to be the final question, which is that we've talked a lot about the traumas, how the traumas can come up, why we might choose polyamory. You said before was fear and knowing or not knowing what you want is the two primary things that will come up to challenge a polyamorous relationship. And we've talked about cultivating this mindfulness and all of that. I don't know if it's been expressly mentioned, but it all runs on this key thread of being able to communicate with each other. And I'm curious if you can offer from your personal experiences to sort of close out the interview here, some techniques, some practices or perspectives to hold in regards to how to communicate with your partners in a polyamorous relationship, in particular when things come to a place of challenge or a place of wounding.
I think it's very important to practice your communication when things are going well. Like, don't just, you don't learn first aid right when there's an emergency situation. You need to learn it beforehand so that you know how to apply it. And, in the worst case scenario. This leads back into what I said I wanted to come back to, which was the emotional body. Our emotional bodies, we don't learn how to exercise them. We don't learn how to strengthen them. And one of the best practices that any individual can do in their relationships is to learn how to strengthen their emotional body. How do we do this? We practice experiencing our reactions to things that trigger those fears. So practicing in communication, there's a great movement called the cuddle party. There's cuddle parties that happen all around the world now. And a piece of the official cuddle parties, not just, we're going to get together and cuddle, but an actual official cuddle party, there's a communication workshop at the beginning of it. And this was co-founded by Marsha Baczynski and Reid Mihalko. And the communication piece, you practice saying no, and you practice receiving a no. And that's a really important piece because the ways that we internalize a no are huge. They bring up all that fear. They said no to me. That must mean that I'm unlovable, or they don't like me, or any number of different stories that we have in our head. So practicing saying no, practicing setting the boundaries. is one very, very important piece to developing emotional dexterity in ourselves. And the other part of that is then practicing asking for what you want. And there's many ways to do this. There are amazing workshops that can take you into looking at the difference between a request and an offer and an invitation. You can state your desires, but a statement of desire doesn't mean it's a request. It's simply, I like ice cream. It's not a request for you to get me ice cream right now. And learning how to finesse your way around that. I think specifically in our very northern North American culture here in Canada, we deal with a lot of passive communication and passive aggressive communication. So tuning into where that can be showing up in your life is really important. On the flip side, there are parts of the world where communication is very overly assertive. And so in that paradigm, I encourage people to learn how to put more compassion into their communication. That's been a big part of my journey. And really learn how to listen.
Mm-hmm. That's a really key piece.
Learn how to listen and to reflect back what you're hearing. And that process of reflection is most profound when it comes without an agenda, without judgment, without trying to fix somebody or offer solutions. Just listen and soak it in, and then offer a reflection for what you heard. Which, you can develop those skills through things like nonviolent communication, through things like the ZEG Forum. And I think that those tools all together can really help us develop more emotional dexterity and a stronger emotional body that then serves us as we go into communicating about our desires and navigating around the fears that arise.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That mention of nonviolent communication as well, I think, is like a key gateway for a lot of people who might be first exposed to this style of communicating with each other. That's a great foundation to wrap your head around right from the beginning. Another piece too, you mentioned this subversive communication or passive aggressiveness, and then overtly assertive communication. And a piece for me in my life, the thing that I'm working with is subversive communication, because that's the examples that I got when I was growing up. Those are the internalized stereotypes. And again, just reinforcing people who are listening to this, if you really want to live in a healthy relationship now and in the future, start looking at what your relationship was to your parents and what their relationship was to each other. Such a key piece. But in that subversiveness, there's what I've learned to communicate is meta communication. Mm-hmm. To open up by saying, hey, I'd like to talk to you about this thing that's happening for me because I'm feeling sort of vulnerable right now and would like to discuss it with you. Or, hey, I would really like to talk about the nature of our relationship right now, and I'm wondering if you're prepared to go into a more vulnerable conversation with me. Everything's good, and I just want to clarify, or I'm feeling not so great and I'd like to have a discussion with you about it beforehand, so it's not subversive in the sense of you're trying to get that other person to acknowledge you or say something to you without directly communicating. And it's not assertive, like you're hanging out, you're watching a movie, and all of a sudden it's like, so I think we should break up. Or like, hey, so I'm angry with you right now. Right? And those being key pieces.
Yeah, having respect for the place that someone else might be in emotionally, I think is really awesome. Another piece that I'd add onto that is if you feel that someone else is communicating to you passive aggressively, you may feel that they're asking you for something, but you're not actually clear what it is that they're asking you for. Very often passive aggressive communication is a way of smuggling our desires. And so you can stop and you can pause and you can say, hey, I hear you saying this thing, and I want to know what it is that you actually want in that. Mm-hmm. Because I'm confused by your message, and I really want to hear you and hear what your desire is at the root of that. and opening up the space for somebody to say that, because we're very afraid of expressing our desires. Because if we express our desires, somebody might say no, and then, the whole world would end. It's not going to end. But we tell ourselves that story, and so we don't express our desires. So if you hear somebody desire smuggling and trying to communicate passively, you can just hold space for them and say, look, I can't guarantee you that I'm going to be able to meet what you're asking for, but I do want to hear it, and I want to have a conversation about it. So please do let me know when you're ready.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thank you for that added piece. I would like to get more information from you about how people can get a hold of you, how they could work with your relationship coaching, how they can check out your blog and read some of the awesome stuff you have up on there.
Yeah, so my coaching website is radicalrelationshipcoaching.ca, and my blog is Polysingleish.com. You can also find me on Facebook. My Facebook page is Radical Relationships, and you can, those are the main ways to get a hold of me. Awesome. You can also email me at melina@radicalrelationshipcoaching.ca.
Great, thank you. I will ensure that all of those are available on the show notes for today's page, which you can find at jameswjesso.com under the section for podcasts, or under the section of ATTMind Radio on the top menu. And Mel, I'd like to thank you again for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, James. It's awesome.
Mm-hmm. So for the listeners out there, thank you again for listening to or watching ATTMind Radio. If you like what you heard, please head over and check out Mel's website and get involved with her work. If you really like what you heard and you'd like to head over to iTunes or Stitcher and leave a positive comment or review, that would be awesome. If you really, really like what you heard, you could go check out Patreon. I know that you've never heard me say that before, but you could go check out Patreon through jameswjesso.com/support and continue or consider donating or pledging a small amount to the podcast and to the continued production of the podcast. And until the next episode, thank you and take care.